On a freezing December evening at Miller's Diner, a struggling waitress named Emma watched as a man stumbled through the door, his clothes torn and filthy, his face weathered by countless nights on the street. He looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. When the diner's manager began to throw him out, calling him an embarrassment and demanding he leave before he drove away real customers, Emma made a choice that would cost her everything. She paid for the homeless man's meal with her own tip money she desperately needed for her daughter's medication. The manager fired her on the spot, humiliating her in front of everyone. But neither Emma nor her cruel boss had any idea who the homeless man really was. What happened next left everyone speechless. Emma Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours straight, and her shift still had 3 more hours to go. The fluorescent lights of Miller's Diner buzzed overhead as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for far too long. She was 32 years old, but some days she felt twice that age. Her daughter Lily was 7, bright and curious, and currently fighting a persistent chest infection that required expensive antibiotics. The prescription sat in Emma's purse, a reminder of the $40 she still needed to scrape together before the pharmacy closed tomorrow. She had picked up every extra shift available this month, working doubles 4 days a week, her feet aching in shoes that were 2 years past needing replacement. Emma's ex-husband had left when Lily was 2, and the child support checks had stopped coming about 6 months after that. It was just the two of them now, making it work however they could. Despite the exhaustion, despite the constant worry about rent and utilities and medication, she remembered every regular customer's name, asked about their families, slipped extra fries onto plates when she thought someone looked hungry. Her coworker, Sarah, often told her she was too soft, that she would never get ahead by giving away free coffee refills and paying attention to sob stories. But Emma could not help herself. She knew what it felt like to struggle, to wonder if you would make it through another month. She had been raised by a mother who believed that kindness cost nothing and was worth everything. And even though her mother had passed 3 years ago, those lessons had stayed with her. As she wiped down the counter near the window, Emma glanced outside at the December snow beginning to fall, hoping the bus would not be late tonight. Lily was staying with their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and Emma hated being away from her daughter for so long. But they needed every penny she could earn. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Richard Sterling stood behind the register, straightening his signature burgundy tie for the 3rd time that hour. He was 45 years old and had been managing Miller's Diner for 8 years, and in that time he had transformed what he considered a mediocre roadside establishment into what he liked to call a respectable dining venue. His suit was always pressed, his shoes always polished, and he expected his staff to maintain similar standards of professionalism. Richard prided himself on his ability to assess customers the moment they walked through the door. He could tell within seconds whether someone was worth the effort, whether they would order the expensive specials or just nurse a cup of coffee for 2 hours taking up valuable table space. His entire management philosophy revolved around maximizing profit per customer, and that meant cultivating the right clientele. He had no patience for what he called undesirables, those people who wandered in looking shabby or uncertain, who counted out coins for a single slice of pie, who asked for water and nothing else. Richard believed these people brought down the atmosphere, made the diner look cheap and desperate. He had instructed his staff multiple times about maintaining standards, about politely but firmly discouraging customers who did not fit the image he was trying to project. In his mind, Miller's Diner was not a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter. It was a business, and businesses needed to be selective about who they served. Emma had been a constant source of frustration for him. She refused to see things his way, always giving free refills when she should be upselling desserts, always chatting with customers who clearly had no money to spend. Richard had considered firing her more than once, but she was reliable and the customers liked her. And finding good staff was difficult. Still, he watched her carefully, waiting for her to make a mistake significant enough to justify letting her go. He had standards to maintain, an image to protect, And he would not let anyone, employee or customer, compromise what he had built here. The door chime rang at 7:15, and a gust of frigid air swept into the diner, along with a figure that made several customers look up from their meals and then quickly look away. The man who entered was tall but stooped, as though the weight of the world had bent his shoulders forward. His coat was an indeterminate color, somewhere between brown and gray, with tears along the sleeves and a hem that dragged muddy and frayed. Beneath it, layers of clothing bunched awkwardly, the kind of desperate layering that spoke of sleeping outside in the cold. His face was weathered and lined, with several days of gray stubble covering his jaw, and his hair hung in tangled clumps around his ears. But it was his eyes that would have caught attention if anyone had looked long enough to notice, sharp and observant despite the exhaustion etched into every other feature. His boots were caked with mud and road salt, leaving wet prints on the clean floor. Emma had mopped just an hour earlier. He moved slowly, uncertainly, like someone who expected to be turned away at any moment. The couple in booth 3 whispered to each other and shifted their young daughter to the far side of the table. The businessman at the counter glanced over, frowned, and returned his attention firmly to his newspaper. A woman waiting for her takeout order took 2 small steps away, clutching her purse more tightly against her body. The man stood just inside the doorway, his presence seeming to create an invisible boundary that no one wanted to cross. He did not approach the counter or move toward a table. He simply stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, his breath coming out in visible puffs as the cold still clung to him. His hands, raw and reddened, hung at his sides. Emma noticed him from across the room where she was delivering a turkey club sandwich to table 5, and her heart immediately constricted with sympathy. Richard noticed him too, but the expression that crossed the manager's face was something else entirely. Richard moved from behind the register with swift, purposeful steps, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He positioned himself directly in front of the man, close enough to make his presence intimidating, far enough to avoid any physical contact. His expression was one of barely concealed disgust, his mouth set in a thin line as he looked the man up and down with obvious disdain. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner, "but this is a private establishment. I am going to have to ask you to leave." The man looked up slowly, meeting Richard's gaze with an unreadable expression. He said nothing, simply stood there as water dripped from his coat onto the floor. Richard's jaw tightened at the silence. He straightened his burgundy tie, a gesture he always made when asserting his authority. "Did you hear me?" Richard continued, his tone sharpening. "This restaurant is for paying customers. We have standards here. You cannot just walk in off the street looking like that and expect to be served." Emma had finished at table 5 and was walking back toward the kitchen when she heard Richard's voice. She stopped, her stomach sinking as she watched the confrontation unfold. She had seen Richard do this before, had watched him turn away people he deemed unworthy, but it never got easier to witness. The cruelty of it, the casual dismissal of another human being, always made her feel sick. Several other customers were watching now, some with expressions of approval, others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. The man finally spoke, his voice quiet and hoarse. "I was hoping I could just sit down for a moment," he said. "Maybe get a glass of water. It is very cold outside." Richard actually laughed, a short, harsh sound. "A glass of water," he repeated mockingly. "Let me guess. You are not planning to order anything else. You just want to take up space in my establishment, drive away my real customers, make this place look like a homeless shelter." Emma felt her hands clench around her order pad. She knew she should not get involved, knew that contradicting Richard in front of customers could cost her job. But she could not just stand there and watch this happen. The man shifted slightly, and Emma could see him swaying just a bit, as though standing required more energy than he had to spare. "Please," he said, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious exhaustion. "I do not want to cause any trouble. I just need to sit down and warm up for a few minutes. Just water would be fine. I have been walking for a very long time." Richard's face flushed with anger at the persistence. He took a step closer, invading the man's space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Let me make this very clear to you," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is not a charity. This is not a warming shelter. This is a business, and I have worked very hard to maintain certain standards here, standards that you very clearly do not meet. Do you understand what I am saying, or do I need to speak more slowly?" The man said nothing. But Emma saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief flash of something she could not quite identify. Richard continued, warming to his subject now, his voice growing louder and more self-righteous. "I have families in here trying to enjoy a nice meal. I have business people who come here after work expecting a clean, respectable environment. What do you think it does to my establishment when someone like you walks in? Do you think those people want to sit near someone who smells like the street? Do you think they want their children exposed to this?" The businessman at the counter nodded slightly in agreement. The couple in booth 3 was whispering again, and Emma could hear the woman saying something about how the manager was absolutely right. Richard gestured toward the door with an imperious wave of his hand. "So, I am going to ask you one more time, politely, to leave my diner. Go to the shelter on 5th Street. That is what those places are for. People like you. This establishment is for a certain class of people. People who can afford to pay for their meals and who understand how to present themselves appropriately in public." The man looked at Richard for a long moment, then glanced around the diner, his gaze passing over the watching customers before finally landing on Emma. She saw something in that look, a quiet assessment, as though he were taking measure of everyone present. Emma could not stand there silent any longer. She moved forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she spoke. "I will serve him," she said clearly. "He can sit in my section." Richard turned to look at her, his expression shifting from surprise to anger in an instant. "Emma," he said, his voice low and warning, "go back to your tables. This does not concern you." "It does concern me," Emma replied, meeting his gaze directly. "He is a customer asking for water and a place to sit. That is what we do here. We serve people." Richard's face darkened further. He stepped away from the man and moved toward Emma, lowering his voice but not enough that nearby tables could not still hear. "We have discussed this before," he said, through clenched teeth. "You have a soft heart, and that is admirable, but you do not understand business. People like him drive away real customers. Look around this diner. Do you see anyone who wants to eat their dinner sitting near someone who looks like that? Do you see any families eager to have their children asking uncomfortable questions about why that man smells bad or why his clothes are torn?" Emma felt her cheeks flush, but held her ground. "He is a human being who is cold and asking for basic kindness," she said quietly. "That matters more than appearances." Richard let out an exasperated breath and glanced around at the watching customers, clearly aware of the audience but also confident most of them agreed with him. "Emma, you are a good waitress," he said, his tone shifting to something almost patronizing. "But you need to understand that compassion and business do not always mix. I am trying to protect this establishment, to protect the jobs of everyone who works here, including yours. Letting people like him come in whenever they want will destroy the reputation I have built. The other customers will stop coming. Revenue will drop. Eventually, we will have to let staff go. Is that what you want?" Emma shook her head. "I want to serve someone who needs help," she said. "That is all. He can sit at table 12 in the back corner. I will take care of him on my own time." Richard crossed his arms. "I am warning you against this." Emma ignored Richard's glare and walked over to the man, gesturing toward the corner booth in the back of the diner. "Please," she said gently. "Come sit down. You look like you need to get off your feet." The man studied her face for a moment, and she saw something soften in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. He followed her to table 12, moving slowly and carefully, as though each step required deliberate thought. When he lowered himself into the booth, he let out a breath that sounded like relief, his shoulders sagging as though he had been holding himself upright through sheer force of will. Emma pulled out her order pad, giving him a moment to settle before speaking. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice warm and without judgment. The man looked up at her, and she noticed that despite the weathered appearance, his eyes were kind. "Just coffee," he said, "and maybe some toast if that is not too much trouble." Of course, Emma said, writing it down. How do you take your coffee? Black is fine, he replied. Emma nodded and turned to go, but then paused and looked back at him. The kitchen made vegetable soup today, she said. It is really good. Would you like some? I am not sure I can pay for soup, the man said quietly, and Emma saw his hands resting on the table, the fingers red and chapped, trembling slightly from the cold. Those hands looked like they had seen hard labor, the knuckles scarred and swollen. Do not worry about that right now, Emma said softly. Let me just bring you some soup. You need to warm up. Before he could protest, she hurried toward the kitchen, aware of Richard's furious stare following her across the diner. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her back as well, could sense their disapproval mixing with curiosity. In the kitchen, she poured a large cup of coffee, put together a generous plate of toast with butter and jam, and ladled out a bowl of soup that was fuller than the standard serving. When she returned to table 12, the man was sitting very still, his gaze fixed on the table surface as though he were lost in thought. Emma set down the coffee, soup, and toast in front of the man, and he looked up at her with an expression of genuine gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You are very kind. She smiled and told him to take his time, that there was no rush. She watched as he wrapped his trembling hands around the coffee mug, absorbing its warmth before taking a careful sip. He ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who had not had a proper meal in days and was trying to make it last. Emma went about her other duties, refilling coffee for her regulars, delivering checks, clearing tables, but she kept glancing back at table 12 to make sure he was all right. After about 20 minutes, the man had finished everything on his plate. Emma approached with the coffee pot to offer a refill, and he shook his head gently. I should probably settle up, he said quietly. How much do I owe you? Emma calculated quickly in her head. The coffee and toast came to $5.70, and the soup was another $4. $9.70, she said. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn wallet. He opened it slowly, and Emma could see it was nearly empty. He counted out some coins and a few crumpled bills, his expression growing more troubled with each second. I am sorry, he said finally, looking up at her with obvious shame. I thought I had enough, but I am short. I have $6.35. Emma did not hesitate. She reached into her apron pocket, where she kept her tips from the evening, pulling out a small wad of ones and change. She had made about $23 so far tonight, money she had been mentally allocating toward Lily's prescription. That is all right, Emma said firmly. I have got it covered. Please. The man started to protest, but Emma was already counting out 4 singles to cover the difference. She was about to turn away when Richard's voice cut across the diner like a knife. Emma, what exactly do you think you are doing? She turned to see him striding toward her table, his face red with fury. Richard reached the table and stood with his hands on his hips, his burgundy tie perfectly straight, his entire posture radiating righteous indignation. His voice was loud enough that every customer in the diner could hear him clearly. And Emma knew that was intentional. He wanted an audience for this. You are paying for his meal, Richard said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. You are actually standing here in my establishment during business hours, using your own money to subsidize someone who walked in here looking like he crawled out of a dumpster. Emma felt her face grow hot, but she kept her voice steady. He did not have quite enough to cover the bill, she said. I am making up the difference. It is only a few dollars. Only a few dollars. Richard repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. Emma, do you have any idea how unprofessional this is? Do you understand what kind of precedent you are setting? If word gets out that we are giving free meals to every vagrant who walks through that door, we will be overrun. This diner will turn into a homeless encampment. That is not what is happening here, Emma said quietly. This is one person who needed one meal. Richard shook his head in exaggerated disbelief, playing to the watching customers. This is exactly the problem with you, Emma. You have always had terrible judgment. You cannot see beyond your own misguided sense of charity to understand the bigger picture. You are a waitress, not a social worker. Your job is to serve paying customers and maximize revenue for this establishment, not to give away food to people who have no business being here in the first place." Emma felt something twist in her chest at his words, at the casual cruelty of them. But she refused to look away from his gaze. "He needed help," she said simply. "That is enough reason for me." Richard let out a harsh laugh. "Of course it is," he said, "because you do not think about consequences. You do not think about how your actions affect the business or the other employees or anyone else. You just act on impulse, throwing away money you probably cannot afford to lose in the first place. Tell me, Emma, how much did you make in tips tonight? $20? $30? And you are just handing it over to a complete stranger who has contributed nothing to society." Emma's hands clenched at her sides. "You do not know anything about his contributions," she said. Richard leaned in closer, his voice becoming even more condescending. "I know exactly what I need to know," he said. "I can tell by looking at him, just like I can tell by looking at you that you make poor decisions. You know what your problem is, Emma. You identify with people like him. You see yourself in them because you are barely hanging on yourself. You are living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to keep your head above water, and instead of working harder to improve your own situation, you give away the little you have to people who are even worse off. That is not compassion, Emma. That is just poor judgment. You are just like the people you defend, and that is why you will never get ahead in life." The words hit Emma like physical blows, each one designed to humiliate and diminish her in front of everyone watching. She saw several customers nodding in agreement with Richard, saw others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. The man at table 12 sat very still, his expression unreadable, watching everything unfold with those sharp, observant eyes. The diner had gone almost completely silent except for the low hum of the kitchen equipment and the occasional clink of silverware. Every eye was on Emma and Richard, and the attention made Emma's skin crawl with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of their judgment, could sense how many of them agreed with Richard's assessment of her. At booth 5, a woman in her 30s had pulled out her phone and was holding it up, clearly recording the confrontation. Emma saw the red recording light and felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. This moment was being captured, would potentially be shared online, would become entertainment for strangers who knew nothing about her life or her struggles. Near the window, 2 college-aged students were also filming, whispering to each other excitedly as though they had stumbled upon some kind of dramatic performance put on for their benefit. The businessman at the counter had set down his newspaper entirely and was watching with his arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as though he found Richard's tirade satisfying. The couple in booth 3 had turned their daughter away from the scene, but they were still watching over their shoulders, the wife nodding along with Richard's words. Emma felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Richard that satisfaction, would not let him see how deeply his words had cut her. Yes, she was struggling. Yes, she lived paycheck to paycheck and worried constantly about money. But that did not make her worthless. That did not mean her compassion was a character flaw. She thought about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to raise Emma alone and had still found time to volunteer at the church soup kitchen every Sunday. Her mother had taught her that your worth was not measured by your bank account, but by how you treated people when they had nothing to offer you in return. Emma took a deep breath and lifted her chin, meeting Richard's gaze squarely. "I would rather struggle with compassion than succeed with cruelty," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously at her defiance. "That is a lovely sentiment," he sneered. "Very inspiring. I am sure it will comfort you when you cannot pay your rent." Throughout this entire exchange, the man at table 12 had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his weathered hands now folded on the table in front of him, his expression giving nothing away. But his eyes moved constantly, tracking from Richard to Emma to the filming customers to the nodding businessman to the couple with their child. He seemed to be cataloging everything, filing away each reaction, each comment, each gesture of support or condemnation. Emma glanced at him briefly and saw something in his gaze that she had not expected, not pity or gratitude or embarrassment at being the cause of this confrontation. Instead, There was a kind of focused intensity, a sharp awareness that seemed completely at odds with his shabby appearance. It was the look of someone who was making careful calculations, who was seeing far more than anyone realized. But then he dropped his gaze back to his empty plate, and the moment passed. Richard was not finished. He turned slightly to address the watching customers, making sure his voice carried throughout the diner. Richard turned back to Emma after his performance for the customers, his expression hardening into something cold and final. He straightened his burgundy tie once more, a gesture that had become his signature move whenever he was about to assert his authority in a way that could not be challenged. "You have put me in an impossible position, Emma," he said, his voice taking on a tone of forced reasonableness, as though he were the victim in this situation. "I have tried to be patient with you. I have overlooked your tendency to give free refills and your habit of spending too much time chatting with customers who are not ordering anything. I have made allowances because you show up on time and the customers generally like you. But this," he gestured toward the man at table 12, "this is too much. This crosses a line that I cannot ignore." Emma said nothing, sensing that he was building toward something worse than what had already been said. Through the window that separated the dining area from the kitchen, she could see Sarah and the other evening waitress, Melissa, watching with tense expressions. Behind them, the cook and the dishwasher had stopped their work and were peering out to see what was happening. Sarah caught Emma's eye and gave her a small, worried shake of her head, a warning that Emma already understood. Richard continued, his voice growing firmer. "I'm going to give you a choice, Emma, and you need to think very carefully before you answer. You can either ask this man to leave right now, apologize to our other customers for this disruption, and we can move past this incident with a formal written warning in your file. Or you can continue with this misguided crusade of yours, and I will terminate your employment effective immediately. Those are your only two options." The diner seemed to hold its breath. Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought about Lily at home with Mrs. Patterson, about the prescription she still needed to fill, about the rent that was due in 8 days, about the electric bill, and the overdue notice from the water company. She thought about how hard it would be to find another job, especially with the holidays coming when no one was hiring. She thought about the reference Richard would give her if she left on bad terms, how he could poison any future opportunities with a single phone call. The practical part of her brain was screaming at her to do what Richard wanted, to apologize and ask the man to leave, to protect her job and her ability to provide for her daughter. But there was another part of her, the part that sounded like her mother's voice, that said some things mattered more than practicality. Some lines should not be crossed no matter what the cost. Emma looked at the man sitting quietly at table 12. He was watching her now, his expression still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that seemed to be asking a question. What kind of person are you really? What do you stand for when it costs you something? She looked back at Richard and saw the certainty in his face, the absolute confidence that she would fold, that she would choose self-preservation over principle because that was what people like her always did. He thought he knew exactly who she was and exactly what she would do. In the kitchen, Sarah had her hand pressed against her mouth, and Melissa's eyes were wide with anxiety. They both knew what Emma should do, what any reasonable person would do in this situation. But Emma had never been very good at doing what was reasonable when it conflicted with what was right. Emma took a slow, steadying breath and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear was still there, the worry about money and bills and how she would manage. But underneath it was something stronger, a certainty that she could live with losing her job, but could not live with the person she would become if she asked that man to leave. "I am not going to ask him to leave," Emma said clearly. Her voice did not waver. "He has done nothing wrong. He came in here cold and hungry and asked for basic human kindness. I am not going to punish him for that." Richard's face went rigid with anger. "Then you are fired," he said flatly. "Take off your apron and leave your order pad on the counter. You have 5 minutes to collect your things and get out of my diner." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma heard someone gasp, heard the woman with the phone shift to get a better angle for filming. She felt the weight of what she had just lost crashing down on her. the enormity of the consequences she would face. But she also felt something else, something that felt almost like relief, as though she had been carrying a heavy burden and had finally set it down. Emma reached behind her back and untied her apron with steady hands. She folded it carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles, and removed her order pad and pen from the pocket. She had worn this apron for 3 years, had served thousands of meals while wearing it, had earned every dollar that kept her daughter fed and housed while wearing it. Now it was just a piece of cloth, a symbol of a job that had never really valued her anyway. She walked to the counter and set the apron down gently, placing the order pad and pen on top of it. Richard stood with his arms crossed, watching her with cold satisfaction. The other customers were silent, some looking uncomfortable now that the confrontation had reached its conclusion, others still nodding in approval of Richard's decision. In the kitchen, Emma could see Sarah wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Emma turned and walked back to table 12 where the man still sat. She looked down at him and felt her composure crack just slightly. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. "I am sorry for how you were treated here. No one deserves that. You came in just looking for warmth and food, and instead you got cruelty. I am sorry I could not do more to help you." The man looked up at her, and for the first time she saw his expression shift into something that might have been admiration. "You did more than you know," he said softly. His voice had changed slightly, the hoarseness fading to reveal something clearer underneath. "You have nothing to apologize for." Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. She walked toward the back where the staff lockers were kept, aware of every eye following her progress across the diner. She retrieved her worn winter coat and her purse, checked to make sure she had everything. When she emerged, Richard was already back at the register, acting as though nothing of consequence had happened. The diner was slowly returning to normal, conversations resuming, silverware clinking against plates. Emma walked toward the door, and just before she reached it, she heard the man at table 12 speak again, his voice carrying across the now quiet space. Emma had her hand on the door handle when the man's voice stopped her. "Excuse me," he said, his tone no longer quiet or hesitant. There was a new quality to it now, something that made several customers look up sharply. "Richard, is it?" Richard turned from the register, irritation flashing across his face at being addressed. "Yes," he said shortly. "And you need to leave as well now that your benefactor has been dismissed." The man ignored this and stood up slowly from the booth. As he rose to his full height, something seemed to shift about him. He no longer looked quite so stooped, quite so defeated. "I have a question for you," the man said. "Do you know who owns this building?" Richard let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "What kind of question is that?" he said. "Of course I know who owns it. It is owned by Morrison Hospitality Group, some massive corporation that owns about 40 diners and restaurants across 6 states. Why would you possibly care about that?" "Have you met the owner?" the man asked. His hands were no longer trembling. Richard scoffed loudly. "Met the owner," he repeated mockingly. "No, I have not met the owner. No one has met the owner. These big corporations are not run by one person sitting in an office somewhere. They are run by boards and executives and regional managers. I report to a district supervisor named Glenn Patterson, who I see maybe twice a year. The actual owner, assuming there even is a single owner and not just a group of shareholders, is probably some billionaire sitting on a yacht somewhere who has never set foot in any of the locations he owns." The man nodded slowly, as though Richard had confirmed something he already knew. "So you have been managing this establishment for 8 years, he said. "And you have never once met the person whose business you are supposed to be representing. You have never received any training on company values or mission statements. You have never been given guidelines on how to treat customers." Richard's jaw tightened with annoyance. "I received a manual when I was hired," he said defensively. "I know the policies. I have increased revenue at this location by 18% since I took over. My numbers speak for themselves. I run a profitable, respectable establishment, and I do not need some homeless person questioning my management style." "Is that what you think makes a successful business?" the man asked. "Profit margins and keeping out the wrong kind of people?" Richard threw up his hands in exasperation. "Why am I even having this conversation?" he said to the watching customers. "This is absurd." Yes, that is exactly what makes a successful business. Revenue, efficiency, maintaining standards that keep quality customers coming back. That is Business 101. Emma stood frozen by the door, watching this exchange with growing confusion. There was something happening here that she did not understand. Some shift in the dynamic that made the air feel charged with tension. The man reached into his torn coat, and Emma saw Richard take an instinctive step backward, his face showing a flicker of uncertainty for the first time. But what the man pulled out was not a weapon. It was a phone, expensive and new-looking, completely incongruous with his shabby appearance. The man tapped the screen of his phone with practiced ease, and the bright display illuminated his weathered face. He held it to his ear and waited only a moment before someone answered. "Catherine," he said, his voice now completely clear and authoritative. "I am at the Miller's Diner location on Route 42. I need you here immediately with a complete file on the management and a change of clothes." "Yes. Right now." Emma watched in stunned confusion. Richard's expression had shifted from annoyance to something closer to uncertainty, though he was clearly trying to maintain his dismissive demeanor. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Who are you calling? Your social worker?" The man ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat. "You will see shortly," he said simply. The diner had gone quiet again, everyone watching this strange confrontation unfold. The woman who had been filming put her phone down, sensing that something more interesting was about to happen. The businessman at the counter leaned forward, his earlier smugness replaced with curiosity. Emma stayed by the door, unable to leave now, drawn by the inexplicable sense that everything was about to change. They waited in tense silence for 7 minutes, though it felt much longer. Then the door opened and a woman in her 40s entered, dressed in an immaculate charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun, carrying a leather briefcase and a garment bag. She moved with the efficiency of someone used to handling urgent situations. "Mr. Morrison," she said, nodding respectfully to the shabby man by the booth. "I have everything you requested." Richard's face went completely white. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that Emma thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The woman, Catherine, walked over to the man and handed him the garment bag first. He took it and gestured toward the restrooms. "I will be just a moment," he said, and walked toward the back of the diner with steady, purposeful strides that bore no resemblance to the shuffling gait he had entered with. Richard found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Morrison," he repeated. "That cannot be. You cannot be." Catherine turned to look at him with cool, professional assessment. "I am Catherine Wells, executive assistant to James Morrison, founder and chief executive officer of Morrison Hospitality Group," she said crisply. "And you must be Richard Sterling, manager of this location." Richard seemed to be having trouble breathing. His hand went to his burgundy tie, clutching it as though it might anchor him to reality. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing to process what she was hearing. Morrison, the owner, the billionaire that Richard had just been mocking, saying he was probably on a yacht somewhere. That man, that homeless-looking man she had fed soup and toast, was James Morrison. The door to the men's room opened, and the man who emerged was transformed. Gone were the torn coat and shabby layers. He now wore a crisp navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, a white shirt and a burgundy tie. His face was the same, weathered and lined, but somehow those features now read differently, not as defeated or broken, but as lived in, as belonging to someone who had seen much and chosen to look closely at the world. James Morrison walked back into the dining area, and the transformation was so complete that several customers gasped audibly. He moved with quiet confidence, his shoulders straight, his bearing that of someone who was accustomed to commanding respect. Catherine handed him the briefcase, and he set it on table 12, opening it to reveal several folders and documents. He looked around the diner, his gaze moving across each watching face before settling on Richard, who looked like he might be sick. "My name is James Morrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent space. "I am the founder and owner of Morrison Hospitality Group, which includes this diner and 39 other locations across 6 states. Some of you may have heard of me, though I try to keep a relatively low profile. What you witnessed here tonight was not an accident or a random occurrence. It was a deliberately orchestrated assessment." Richard made a strangled sound, his hand still clutching his tie. "For the past 8 months," he continued, "I have been conducting undercover operations at various locations throughout my company. I dress as someone experiencing homelessness and enter these establishments to see how my employees treat the most vulnerable members of our communities. I do this because I believe that the true character of any business is revealed not in how it treats its wealthiest customers, but in how it treats those who have nothing to offer in return. My father was homeless for 3 years when I was a child. I remember what it felt like to be looked at with disgust, to be treated as less than human simply because of our circumstances. When I built this company, I made a promise to myself that no one would ever be turned away from one of my establishments simply because they could not afford a meal or because they did not look prosperous enough." Emma felt tears streaming down her face now, though she was not entirely sure why she was crying. Relief, shock, vindication, all of it mixed together into something overwhelming. James Morrison turned to look at her, his expression kind. "This young woman," he gestured toward Emma, "demonstrated exactly the values that I had hoped to find in my employees. She saw a human being in need and responded with compassion, even when it cost her personally. She stood up to unjust treatment, even when it meant losing her job. That is the kind of person I want representing my company." Richard had begun shaking his head desperately. "Mr. Morrison, please. I did not know. I had no idea it was you." "If I had known," Richard began, his voice high and panicked. James held up a hand, silencing him. "That is precisely the problem, Richard," he said quietly. "You treated me with contempt and cruelty because you thought I was powerless, because you thought there would be no consequences. That reveals everything I need to know about your character and your fitness to manage one of my locations." Catherine had pulled out a tablet and was taking notes, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The other customers sat in stunned silence, several of them looking deeply uncomfortable now as they realized they had been part of this assessment as well, and many of them had failed it just as badly as Richard had. Richard's face had gone from white to a sickly gray color, sweat beading on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the diner. His hands were shaking as he took several stumbling steps toward James Morrison, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "Mr. Morrison, please, you have to understand," Richard said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I was just trying to protect the business. I was trying to maintain standards like I thought you would want. The manual, the training I received, it emphasized creating a quality dining experience for customers. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting your investment." James looked at him with an expression of profound disappointment. "The manual says nothing about turning away people based on their appearance," he said quietly. "In fact, if you had read it carefully, you would have found an entire section on treating every person who walks through our doors with dignity and respect." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I must have missed that section," he stammered. "There is so much to remember, so many policies. But if I had known, if anyone had told me that this was important to you, I would have done things differently. I swear I would have." "That is the problem, Richard," James said. "You should not need to be told to treat people with basic human decency. That should not be a policy you follow because your boss requires it. That should be who you are as a person." Richard glanced around desperately at the watching customers, as though seeking support or sympathy, but found none. The businessman at the counter was staring down at his coffee, his earlier smile gone. The couple in booth 3 were whispering urgently to each other, the husband's face red with embarrassment. The woman who had been filming had put her phone away entirely and was studying the table, as though she wished she could disappear. "Please," Richard continued, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was painful to hear. "I have worked here for 8 years. I have given everything to this job. My whole life is this diner. I increased revenue. I kept costs down. I made this location profitable. That has to count for something. You made this location profitable by creating an environment of exclusion and judgment," James said. "You made people feel unwelcome based on arbitrary standards that have nothing to do with their worth as human beings. And worse," he gestured toward Emma, "you punished an employee for showing compassion. You tried to force her to compromise her values to keep her job. That is not the kind of management I will tolerate in my company." Emma stood near the door, still processing everything that had happened. She felt like she was watching a movie. Like this could not possibly be real. 20 minutes ago, she had been fired and facing financial ruin. Now the owner of the entire company was standing in front of her defending her actions. It felt surreal, dreamlike, too good to be true. But James Morrison's presence was undeniably real, as was the panic on Richard's face. Catherine was still taking notes on her tablet, documenting everything. Sarah and Melissa had emerged from the kitchen and were standing in the doorway, their eyes wide with shock. James Morrison turned to Catherine and spoke clearly so everyone in the diner could hear. "Catherine, please prepare termination paperwork for Richard Sterling, effective immediately. The grounds are discrimination, creating a hostile work environment, and conduct unbecoming of a Morrison Hospitality Group manager. Ensure he receives any owed wages and unused vacation time, but make it clear that we will not be providing a positive reference." Richard made a choking sound. "You cannot do this," he said desperately. "You cannot just fire me without warning, without a formal review process. There are procedures." James looked at him with something close to pity. "You fired Emma without warning or due process just minutes ago," he said. "You gave her an ultimatum and terminated her employment on the spot. I am simply extending you the same courtesy you showed her. The difference is that her firing was unjust, and yours is entirely deserved." Richard's legs seemed to give out, and he grabbed the counter to steady himself. His carefully maintained composure had crumbled completely, revealing the small, frightened man underneath. James turned away from him and walked toward Emma, who stood frozen in disbelief. "Miss Carter," he said gently. "Emma, if I may. I owe you an apology for putting you in this situation, for making you choose between your job and your principles. That was not fair to you, but it was necessary for me to understand what kind of people are running my establishments." Emma found her voice, though it came out shaky. "You have nothing to apologize for," she managed. James smiled. "I would like to offer you the position of manager of this location," he said. "The salary is $52,000 annually, significantly more than you were making as a waitress, plus full health benefits for you and your daughter, performance bonuses, and an education assistance program if you want to pursue any additional training. I need people like you in leadership positions, people who understand that true hospitality means treating every person who walks through that door with kindness and respect." Emma felt her knees go weak. $52,000. Health benefits. She thought about Lily's prescription, about the overdue bills, about the constant fear of not having enough that had haunted her for years. She thought about her mother, who would have been so proud in this moment. "I do not know what to say," Emma whispered. "Say yes," James said. "Say you will help me rebuild the culture here into something worthy of the Morrison name. Say you will train your staff to see people the way you see them, not as transactions or problems to be managed, but as human beings deserving of dignity." Emma wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I will do that. I promise, I will." 3 months passed, and Miller's Diner had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. Emma stood behind the counter on a cold March evening, reviewing the schedule for the following week and making notes about inventory. She still felt a small thrill of disbelief when she looked at her name on the office door, at the professional clothes she now wore instead of the old apron, and at the respect in her employees' eyes when she gave instructions. The diner looked largely the same, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Emma had implemented new training protocols for all staff, emphasizing that every customer deserved the same level of service regardless of their appearance or apparent ability to pay. She had established a community partnership program where the diner donated unused food to local shelters at the end of each night. And she had created a discreet system where anyone could come in and ask for a job application, which was code for receiving a free meal without the shame of asking for charity. The staff had embraced these changes wholeheartedly. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager and had become Emma's closest ally in reshaping the culture. Melissa and the kitchen staff had all received raises and were noticeably happier in their work. Several new hires had joined the team, all carefully selected, not just for their experience but for their compassion and character. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Customer satisfaction scores had increased dramatically. Revenue had actually gone up, not down, as Richard had predicted, because word had spread about the diner's welcoming atmosphere and excellent service. Families came regularly, knowing their children would be treated kindly. Elderly customers on fixed incomes felt comfortable ordering just coffee and sitting for hours without being pressured to leave. The diner had become a genuine community gathering place rather than just a business transaction. Emma had even established a suspended meal program where customers could pay for an extra meal that would be given to someone in need. The board by the register showed 43 suspended meals currently available, a testament to the generosity the new policies had inspired in others. Last week, Emma had received a personal visit from James Morrison, who had come to review the changes she had implemented. He had sat in the diner for 2 hours, observing interactions, talking to staff and customers, and reviewing the financial reports. When he left, he had shaken her hand and told her she was exactly the kind of leader he had hoped to find. He had also mentioned something that had surprised her. Richard Sterling had reached out to him 6 weeks after being fired. Not to beg for his job back, but to apologize. He had taken a position as a customer service representative at an insurance company, a significant step down from management, and had written James a letter explaining how the experience had forced him to confront his own prejudices and cruelty. Richard had asked if there was any way he could be involved in training programs about treating customers with dignity, wanting to share his story as a cautionary tale. James had been impressed enough to put Richard in touch with the Human Resources Department to explore possibilities. Emma had mixed feelings about this news, but she also understood that people could change, that humiliation could lead to growth if a person was willing to learn from it. On a sunny afternoon in late March, James Morrison returned to Miller's Diner unannounced. This time he was dressed in his usual business attire, and Emma greeted him warmly at the door, leading him to a quiet booth where they could talk. He had news to share, he told her. The Morrison Foundation, his charitable organization, had just approved a major grant to the homeless shelter on 5th Street. The same shelter Richard had dismissively mentioned that cold night 3 months ago. The donation was $250,000, enough to expand the shelter's capacity by 40 beds, hire additional counselors, and establish a job training program. James explained that his undercover visits to his various locations had reminded him how many people were struggling, how thin the line was between stability and crisis, and how much impact targeted support could have. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. She thought about that night, about the choice she had made, about how terrifying it had been to lose her job, and how impossible it had seemed that anything good could come from it. But that one moment of kindness, that decision to pay for a stranger's meal with money she desperately needed, had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She had a stable job now, health insurance for Lily, enough money to not just survive but to actually save a little each month. More than that, she had the opportunity to create an environment where kindness was valued, where people were treated with dignity, where compassion was seen as a strength rather than a weakness. James reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "You reminded me why I started this company," he said quietly. "You reminded me that business and humanity do not have to be at odds with each other." Emma smiled through her tears. "You reminded me that doing the right thing matters, even when it is hard," she replied. "The truth is that we never really know who someone is when they walk through our door. We do not know their story, their struggles, their worth. That homeless-looking man could be a billionaire testing our character, or he could be someone who has simply fallen on hard times and needs a moment of grace. But it should not matter. Every person deserves to be treated with kindness and respect, not because of what they can do for us, but because of their inherent dignity as a human being. Emma had learned that the measure of a person is not found in their bank account or their appearance or their social status. It is found in how they treat others when no one is watching, when there is no reward for kindness except the knowledge that it was the right thing to do. One act of compassion can change a life, can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or measure. Emma had offered a meal to a stranger, and in return she had been given an opportunity to lift up not just herself, but an entire community. That is the power of kindness, the transformative potential of treating every person we meet as though they matter. Because they do. We live in a world that often values profit over people, that judges worth by appearances, that teaches us to protect ourselves by keeping others at a distance. But Emma's story reminds us that there is another way, a better way, a way that honors our shared humanity and creates space for unexpected grace. So, the next time you see someone who looks down on their luck, someone who does not fit your expectations, someone who seems to have nothing to offer, remember Emma. Remember that how you treat that person says everything about who you are and nothing about who they are. Choose kindness. Choose compassion. Choose to see the human being in front of you rather than making assumptions based on appearances. Because you never know who someone really is, and you never know how one small act of grace might change everything.